The pampered life of a medieval princess, the storybook castle, the feasts, the beautiful dresses and the adoring subjects. What if I were to tell you that all of that is a lie? Peel away a romanticized veneer, and there's a harsh reality beneath it. Beneath the gilded walls of Europe's castles, many royal daughters led lives marked by danger, duty, and despair. A medieval princess's existence was seldom the fairy tale that we imagine. Instead, it was bounded by ironclad expectations from birth. She was born not for herself, but for her dynasty, there to fulfill a purpose. So consider a young girl, perhaps around 12 years old, sent across the sea to marry a complete stranger decades older than her. Childhood abruptly ended. Or imagine a king's daughter locked in a convent at 7 to remove her from the political chessboard. Or maybe even a noble bride who, after failing to bear a son, is thrown aside or framed for dynastic crises. Not isolated horrors at all. I don't mention them randomly. But these are just common threads in the lives of princesses during the Middle Ages. And so today, that is what we are going to look at. The miserable life of a medieval princess. A crown of gold, lined with thorns. Welcome to any newcomers of the channel. I'm sure you know what you're in for. But let me tell you what you're not in for. Ads. On this channel we hate ads. And we know you do too. So we've got them all turned off. It's a kind of foaming at the mouth, irrational hatred that we actually see as a point of personal pride. But what we do have is a very large support base on Patreon, YouTube memberships. We also have a merch store, and we have the occasional kind person who donates rather through super thanks on YouTube or the PayPal link. All of those links can be found in the pinned comment or video and channel description. But if you can't afford to do that, don't do it. The best thing you can do for us is just spread the word of this ad-free oasis here on YouTube. A life raft in the stormy sea, I suppose. And just do the whole like, comment, subscribe, hype button, algorithm boosting things. And now that I've said it once, I won't say it again. Get relaxed, and we can begin our talk on the miserable existence of a medieval princess. Enjoy. So from the moment a royal daughter drew her first breath, her life was charted along a course of duty. In Western Europe's royal families, whether they were Frankish, English, French, or Spanish, a princess's birth was a dynastic asset. Her parents saw not just a child, but a future bargaining chip, an alliance sealed in flesh and blood. Now, this pragmatic view of daughters meant that their upbringing was carefully tailored to the roles they were expected to play. A medieval princess was usually raised in privilege and piety, but often in relative isolation from her parents. It was not unusual for royal children to have their own separate households. For example, in the 13th century England, King Edward I's younger daughters spent much of their childhood apart from the itinerant royal court. They were entrusted to nurses, tutors, noble guardians, rather than doted upon daily by their actual parents. They were way too busy for that. The chroniclers note that even a devoted father like Edward I saw his daughters rarely while they were young, as they were kept in the royal nursery or sent to stay with relatives, learning proper comportment from other ladies of the court. And this distance was practical. Kings and queens were often on the move or consumed by affairs of state. and young children were safer and better educated in stable households. But emotionally, you can imagine that it could be quite a cold upbringing, and I don't think we have to delve into the historical records to come to that conclusion. A princess might form stronger bonds with her ladies-in-waiting, or a beloved governess, than with her own father and mother. I mean, they're effectively shooing them off to replacements, aren't they? Education for a princess in the Middle Ages went far beyond needlework and deportment. Royal daughters were trained from an early age to be the ideal gentlewoman and future consort, basically just molding them into a best product. Now, this included mastery of languages, especially Latin or French in many courts, and often multiple vernacular tongues, if international marriage was likely. They learned music, dancing, and poetry to entertain and display courtly grace. But equally important was instruction in managing a great household, overseeing servants, planning great feasts, directing charity for the poor, because one day they would be the lady of a princely court, or even the top job, a queen. Medieval guides to female behavior reveal the intense pressure on princesses to cultivate virtue and wisdom. The late 14th century author Christine de Pizan, writing in The Treasure of the City of Ladies, advised that a royal woman must surpass all other ladies in good prudence, moral standards, conduct, and manners. In other words, a princess was expected to be a paragon, learned but modest, gracious but firm, pious yet politically astute. Any error in manners or morals would reflect not just upon her, but on the entire royal family. A young princess grew up acutely aware that her comportment was constantly watched and judged, so you can imagine the psychological burden on a child being trained to embody near impossible ideals of perfection. For some princesses, upbringing could take an even more extreme turn, being shut away from the world for strategic reasons. A striking case is that of Charlemagne's daughters in the 8th to 9th centuries. Emperor Charlemagne, the ruler of the Franks, famously refused to marry off any of his daughters, an almost unheard-of policy for a king. According to the court biographer Einhard, Charlemagne kept his daughters at home because he could not bear to part with them, insisting that they stay in his company always. Well, it sounds sweet, but the unintended result? These women were denied the normal path of marriage and motherhood afforded to princesses. Several took lovers and bore children out of wedlock, a scandalous situation that the emperor apparently tolerated while he lived, but it came back to haunt his daughters later. In any case, after Charlemagne's death, his pious son, Louis the Debonair, what a name that is, forced his unmarried sisters into convents, effectively ending their worldly lives. Thus, princesses could find themselves cloistered not out of personal devotion, but because of a father's overprotectiveness, or even a brother's zeal for propriety. Similarly, in 13th century England, King Henry III's daughter Mary was dispatched to a nunnery at the age of 7, and not due to any calling of her own, but just as a political convenience. She was one less pawn in the marriage market, and another offering to the church. Little Mary of England was veiled as a novice by age 12. Her life as a potential wife and mother cut off before it began. Yet behind convent walls, a princess took a princess could not fully escape the world's expectations. Mary of Woodstock, as Henry's daughter is known, grew up to be an abbess who mingled in court politics, at one point even accumulating debts from gambling and being entangled posthumously in a scandal when noblemen claimed to have been her lover. The church refuge did not spare her the intrigues and tarnish that haunted royal women. But nothing epitomized the lack of autonomy of a medieval princess more than the arrangements made for her marriage. In royal circles, marriages were not love matches. They were just treaties on two legs. A princess's hand in marriage was a diplomatic tool, a currency to buy a peace or cement alliances between kingdoms. The idea that she might choose her own spouse was almost unthinkable. Her parents, especially her father, made that choice in service of their political strategy. Medieval chronicles and letters are rife with evidence that princesses were betrothed as infants or even toddlers, their futures pledged to strangers, long before they could even understand what marriage meant, let alone all the rest of it. By the High Middle Ages, it was common for princesses of Western Europe to be married off in their early teens. At the age of 12 or 13, what we would today consider childhood, a royal daughter might be dispatched to a foreign land to marry a bloke she'd never even met. The human aspect of this could be heart-wrenching. The princess would travel away from her home, often never to return, accompanied by a grand entourage and a big old dowry, yet leaving behind everything familiar: her mother, father, siblings, friends, the comforts of her native culture. Contemporary chronicles sometimes remark on the farewells of these girls, and one can only imagine the tears of a 14-year-old French princess, leaving, knowing she might never see her family again, or to fulfill a marriage pact arranged before she was even aware of it. As an observer noted of one such journey, the young bride wept as the shores of her beloved homeland vanished from view. These were children. Remember that. Children thrust into roles of wives and peace weavers between nations. Just another piece on the chessboard, I'm afraid. Well, the age disparities in these marriages could often be quite eyebrow-raising. For dynastic reasons, widowers or older kings often took teen princesses as new brides. The case of Isabella of France illustrates the extreme of that. She was only about 12 years old in 1308 when she married King Edward II of England, who was 23. By medieval standards, this was pretty normal. It didn't really matter. A girl at the age of 12 was deemed marriageable. But I suppose the psychological and emotional gap is not something they really took into account. Well, Isabella's initial experiences in England were quite miserable. The young French princess found that her husband neglected her in favor of his male favorite, Piers Gaveston. Isabella wrote letters back to France, complaining that she had too little company of the king, and that she felt humiliated at Edward's court. Well, this neglected bride, still barely a teenager, was essentially powerless to change her situation. Her duty was simply to endure, to try and charm her husband and win allies among his barons, all while hoping to conceive a royal heir. Isabella's story would later take a dramatic turn. She famously rebelled against Edward II as an adult, but in these early years she exemplified the vulnerability of a trapped princess. Another poignant example is that of Joan of England, called Joan of the Tower, daughter of Edward II and Isabella. In 1328, at the age of 7, little Joan was married to the 6-year-old David, Prince of Scotland, to seal a peace treaty. Two mere children stood at the altar as symbols of reconciliation between warring kingdoms. For Joan, marriage meant being raised in a foreign Scottish court, away from her mother and familiar England. And as she grew older, her husband, by then King David II, largely just ignored her, and he was openly seeing other women, keeping mistresses. He wasn't even trying to hide it. Although that's being, let's be fair, I mean, he didn't really want to get married either, so he was probably pretty miserable with the arrangement. It's probably a little bit of rebellion, maybe making up for lost time, who knows. In any case, Joan didn't really have any power to object. Her role was simply to play the queen and, sit down and be quiet, maintain the alliance. She remained childless, and after many lonely years, she eventually returned to England, effectively estranged from David. People even called her Joan Makepeace, because her only significance had been to make peace between nations, a sad encapsulation of a princess's fate. Her marriage existed to serve diplomacy, not to bring her happiness. And indeed, even if there was a small light at the end of the tunnel, well, she didn't quite reach it. No happiness for her, I'm afraid. But it was not only the English and French princesses who faced such situations. Across Western Europe, royal daughters were exchanged like valuable pieces on the chessboard of politics. Spanish infantas, Italian nobledonne, German ducal ladies. They all understood that duty demanded a marriage that strengthened family interests. A Castilian princess might be married to a Portuguese prince to secure a border treaty. A Burgundian duke's daughter wed to a French royal to ensure loyalty of a region, or a Norwegian princess given to an English prince to cement a trade alliance. The motives weren't always the same. They could go from securing peace, gaining a rich dowry, maybe inheritance rights, trade concessions. But the princess's personal preference, well, that never entered the equation. As one medieval proverb succinctly put it, marriage goes where advantage lies. Well, I suppose we can say that at least in our year, 2025, people don't marry for material reasons anymore. It's never about the money, right? Yeah. Perhaps they'll be making a history about that in 100 years' time. Well, for the princesses, though, advantage was calculated by kings and councillors in council chambers, not by the girls in question. There were rare occasions. A princess might attempt to defy these marital plans. One remarkable story is that of Joan of Acre, not Joan of Arc, Joan of Acre, a daughter of England's Edward I. Widowed young, Joan was expected to hurry up and remarry a foreign noble of her father's choosing, eeny, meeny, miny, mo kind of situation. The king had lined up a wealthy European count as her next husband. But Joan, she fell in love with a mere knight in her household, Ralph de Monthermer. In a bold act of independence, she secretly married Ralph in 1297, without the king's permission. Is there someone you forgot to ask? When her father learned of this clandestine union, he was not impressed, flew into a rage even, off the handle, as they say. King Edward imprisoned poor Ralph in a castle dungeon, and he confiscated Joan's lands by way of punishment. Joan herself, a princess turned rebel, had to plead for forgiveness. According to chronicles, she even sent her small children from her first marriage to their royal grandfather as supplicants, hoping to smooth things over a little bit. In time, Edward relented, reportedly after realizing that Joan was pregnant with Ralph's child. They weren't wasting any time getting to that, apparently. And he released her husband begrudgingly, recognizing that the marriage was, well, it just is what it is. Joan of Arc's story is often noted as one of the few genuine love stories of medieval princesses. But even in success, it shows how extraordinarily dangerous such defiance was. You see, Joan had the mettle and a little bit of luck to eventually win her father's acceptance. But most princesses would not dare risk the wrath of their family and the potential political fallout of choosing their own mate. So, the wedding itself, that was a different thing. You see, marriage for a medieval princess was an obligation tied with a ribbon and a knot of sacrifice. The ceremony was filled with jewels, ceremonies, and celebrations. But once those candles burned down, she found herself in a pretty unfair contract. Any personal contentment was a matter of chance. Well, if she was lucky, affection might bloom over time. And yes, some royal couples did grow to love or at least respect each other. If she was unlucky, though, she might endure neglect, mistreatment, or simply a cold partnership of convenience. But love and luck had very little to do with it. It was all about duty. She had to get married, whether she agreed or not. Well, just a few of the key reasons. We have forging alliances. A union could seal peace treaties or even create bonds between rival kingdoms, clearing up any political difficulties. Then dynastic ambitions. Marriage could press a claim or unite two thrones. Think about it when a princess brought a claim to inheritance in her dowry, things like this. Then wealth and territory. Princesses often came with dowries of land or gold that made them pretty attractive bargains on the political market. And then we also have the route of succession and heirs. You see, by marrying into another royal line, a princess was expected to bear children who might inherit or strengthen both families' claims to continue the lineage. Now, if none of these in none of these calculations was her own desire given any weight, marriage was just the destiny and duty. Bad luck, I'm afraid. Well, once married, the medieval princess's trials were certainly far from over. In many ways, they were just the beginning. Uprooted from her homeland, she had to find her footing in a foreign court, where everything could feel alien. The language, the customs, the food, the climate. So we can imagine a young English princess sent to marry in the Spanish court of Castile, arriving in a very warm and sun-baked land of unfamiliar architecture and elaborate court ritual, struggling to understand the rapid Spanish speech around her. Or a French princess sent over the Alps to marry an Italian noble, suddenly immersed in the rich, volatile politics of the city-states. Far different, of course, from the northern feudalism that she knew. These women often felt a profound homesickness. Medieval letters do occasionally survive in which queens and noble ladies write longingly of home. For instance, one 12th century English princess turned queen in Sicily, Joanna, daughter of Henry II of England, reportedly begged her brother for news from home after years in a Latin Mediterranean court, a world apart from the lands of her youth. Upon arrival in her new home, a princess was expected to adapt swiftly and seamlessly. She had to learn the social hierarchy and etiquette of her husband's court, whom to greet first, how deeply to bow, which local saints' feasts days to honor, and subtle rivalries among the nobility. All eyes were on her, as the newcomer and as a representative of her natal family. If a princess brought attendants from her homeland, which many did, ladies, knights, chaplains, etc., that could cause a bit of friction with the locals, and a famous example of that is Anne of Bohemia, who married King Richard II of England in 1382. Though Anne was well liked by Richard, the English commoners initially resented her Bohemian household and the costly wedding arrangements. Chroniclers note that some in London grumbled about these foreigners taking positions and favor. A princess had to tread carefully to avoid appearing aloof or too partial to her own countrymen. She walked a bit of a tightrope. Integrate enough to be accepted, but uphold enough of her own prestige to command respect. No one likes a doormat. Loneliness was the common companion for these young women. In many cases they had no one to confide in who truly understood their upbringing, or their mother tongue, rather. A medieval court could be a pretty hostile environment for an outsider, especially if political factions opposed the marriage. We hear of queens who were ostracized or poorly treated by their husbands' families. Isabella of England, a 14th century English princess, married into the powerful German court as the wife of Emperor Frederick II. She was around 12, and he was nearly 40. The emperor was oft absent, waging wars in Italy, and Isabella lived in a far-flung Sicilian palace. Accounts suggest she struggled to fit in among her Latin-speaking courtiers, many of whom viewed her as an irrelevant teenager. In such scenarios, a princess might turn to increased piety or patronage of the arts to fill her days, safe outlets in a potentially unfriendly court. Nevertheless, a resourceful princess could also carve out a sphere of influence in her new home. By tradition, royal wives were given a dower, that is, lands or incomes set aside for their maintenance. Administering these estates gave a princess some practical responsibilities and power. At least it was something to do, I guess. Many princesses turned queens became noted patrons of local projects, founding monasteries, sponsoring scholars, or introducing fashions from their homelands. For example, Eleanor of Castile, after marrying England's Edward I, brought some tastes of Spain with her, even reportedly introducing more cosmopolitan styles of gardening and court cuisine. She also engaged in substantial land management and business deals, earning a reputation, fair or not, as a shrewd, even hard-nosed manager. But that being said, Eleanor's primary duty in England was to support her husband and bear children, which she did prodigiously, not to implement cultural exchange. Any influence she wielded was informal and always dependent on the king's favor. In other cases, a princess in a foreign court had to face outright hostility. Perhaps the most harrowing example is found in the feud of the Merovingian Franks in the 6th century. Brunhilda of Austrasia, a Visigothic princess from Spain, married King Sigbert of the Franks, and packed her things and moved to Gaul. Her sister, Galswintha, likewise married another Frankish king, Chilperic. But the Frankish court was divided and treacherous. Galswintha found herself unloved. Her husband Chilperic preferred his mistress Fredegund. And in a grim turn of events, Galswintha was found strangled in her bed, very likely murdered at Fredegund's urging. This murder of a foreign princess sparked decades of war, as Brunhilda sought revenge for her sister. Brunhilda herself navigated a stormy life too. After Sigbert's assassination, she ruled as regent, only to be eventually betrayed and executed. Though Brunhilda was a queen and ruler for a time, her fate reminds us how dangerous the foreign court could be. A princess was vulnerable to factional hatred, and if she became too entangled in politics, she could end up a casualty of power struggles. In Brunhilda's case, the chronicler Gregory of Tours paints a pretty grim picture of a brilliant but embattled princess, queen, ultimately dragged into a horrific death. How horrific? Well, apparently she was tied to wild horses and torn apart as her foes cheered. Doesn't get much more horrific than that. Poor thing. Well, few princesses faced an end that gruesome, but many would empathize with the core experience, that of being a political outsider struggling to survive the intrigues of an adopted home. But let's look at a more typical tale. We might look into the 15th century to find that Margaret of Anjou, a French-born princess who married King Henry VI of England. Arriving in England during the late stages of the 100 Years' War, Margaret encountered suspicion. Some English subjects feared that she was too French in her sympathies. She had to win over a court divided by factions, and eventually she even led a faction of her own to protect her husband's throne during the Wars of the Roses. Margaret's life in England was anything but tranquil. She effectively became a general and a leader of her party in a civil war, and not many princesses went that route. But though it is far from the norm, her case does show that a foreign princess did sometimes have to fight, whether it be metaphorically or literally, for her position and for acceptance. Despite the challenges, there were instances of genuine integration and contentment. A princess who produced healthy heirs, charmed the common people, and managed not to offend the local nobility, could become quite accepted and popular, even beloved. Anne of Bohemia, mentioned earlier, though initially met with skepticism in England, endeared herself with her gentle demeanor and support of King Richard II's peace policies. She became known as Good Queen Anne, and her early death from plague was widely mourned by the English. In that sense, a princess's fortunes at court could change over time. Early loneliness might give way to loyalty from her new subjects if she navigated the cultural transition successfully. But still, even in the best of cases, a princess lived as a foreigner till the end of her days. She might never see again the land of her birth, speaking like a New Yorker, or the family that she left behind. When letters arrived from home, they were treasured missives, sometimes filled with aching expressions of longing on both sides. And we have records of queens writing to their fathers or brothers across the continent, sending gifts and news, but also subtle reminders of shared kinship, as if to keep those ties alive despite the distance. A medieval princess learned to put on a brave face in public, gracious and smiling, concealing whatever sorrow or homesickness she might feel. To the world, she was the noble consort, perfectly at ease in her adopted nation. But in private, she might pray through tears for the well-being of the family that she desperately missed. But of all the expectations heaped upon the princess, none was more relentless than that insatiable demand that she bear children. And not just any children, male heirs. Once married, the princess-turned-wife was expected to get to work as soon as possible to conceive and secure the lineage. Frankly, the womb was just a device, a vessel for dynastic continuity. Chroniclers and family members anxiously tracked her status, kind of like a child in the back seat of a car. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? This kind of thing. Are you pregnant yet? Have you delivered a son? How many children? This kind of thing. Oh, imagine it. Well, in royal marriages, love might have been optional, but fertility was essential. A princess who did not or could not produce children faced tremendous pressure, sometimes open blame and repudiation. The physical toll this expectation took on women was immense. I'm sure any girls listening can attest to that. Consider the case of Eleanor of Castile, Queen of England in the late 13th century. She was married to Edward I at around 13 years old, and spent nearly 30 years of her life either pregnant or recovering from pregnancy. Get this, how's this for a record? She gave birth to around 16 children. The exact number is debated, but certainly over a dozen. You think you'd start to forget their names after a while. Only about 6 of those children survived to adulthood, a sadly typical ratio in the age of high infant and child mortality. But the repeated pregnancies, miscarriages, and burying of infants, now that must have been not just physically exhausting, but emotionally devastating. One contemporary account notes that toward the end of her childbearing years, Eleanor was worn down in body and spirit, having endured so many confinements and losses. Ultimately, she died at the age of 49, shortly after giving birth to what would have been her 16th child, likely weakened by the cumulative strain on her health. Her husband directed the famous Eleanor crosses across England to honor her memory, an acknowledgement of her significance. But you might also view the crosses as silent witnesses to a queen who literally gave her life in an effort to produce heirs, just turned into a baby factory, I suppose. Pretty terrible, pretty terrible. I mean 2 or 3, yeah, fair enough, but 16? That's too many. In any case, Eleanor's experience, while extreme in the number of children, was not unique in kind. Medieval noblewomen often had very high fertility rates, as they tried to ensure at least one surviving male heir, and it was not uncommon for a princess to bear 8 or 10 children over her married life, knowing that perhaps only a few might get past childhood, given the era's medical limitations. And of course, each pregnancy carried risk. Although exact maternal mortality statistics are hard to come by, historians estimate that in medieval Europe, a woman of childbearing age faced a significant lifetime risk of death from childbirth complications, sometimes estimated at roughly 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 of maternal death per pregnancy over a lifetime. But many did survive multiple births, while others tragically died young. Princess Catherine of Aragon, though technically more Renaissance than medieval by her prime at least, famously said, quote, "Having children is what we are made for," reflecting the ingrained belief that a noblewoman's destiny was motherhood. Yet Catherine herself lost many infants, and only had 1 surviving child, demonstrating how fraught that destiny could be. Of course, the sex of the children was enormously important too. In the succession system, Bearing sons was the ultimate duty. A princess who bore a healthy son quickly would be lauded and secure her position. But if years passed without a male heir, rumors would start. Was the marriage cursed? Was God withholding favor? Maybe, who knows? And though we know now that the father's genetic contribution determines a child's sex, medieval people usually placed the blame on the mother if only daughters came forth. Well, one of the most famous examples of pressure for a male heir earlier in the medieval era is King Louis VII of France and Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor of Aquitaine was a powerful and brilliant woman, but after years of marriage to Louis VII, they had only produced daughters. Louis was anxious for a son, and perhaps frustrated with Eleanor's strong-willed personality, eventually sought an annulment of the marriage, on the pretext of consanguinity, but effectively because he wanted a male heir. Eleanor was sent away, promptly marrying Henry II of England, with whom she would have sons. So, what does that tell you? Anyway, Louis remarried and finally obtained a son by his second wife. But this whole episode shows that a princess' worth in marriage was measured not by just children, but by sons more specifically. Failing that, her position could be in jeopardy. It's pretty cruel, even after bearing that many children, if there's no sons. Basically King Louis VII saying, "This one isn't any good, I want a new wife." Yeah, that's pretty terrible. Well, childbearing was not only dangerous, but it was also profoundly private grief wrapped in public scrutiny. A royal pregnancy was a state event. Courtiers noted signs of the princess's condition, and announcements were made when she took to her chamber in the later stages of pregnancy as per custom. When labor came, it often did so in a crowded room, midwives and ladies attending, perhaps even trusted counselors or churchmen in the adjacent chamber waiting to witness the child's sex, certainly with fingers crossed, I assume. After the ordeal of birth, if the baby was a boy, cannons might fire, and church bells would ring. If it was a girl, there might be polite congratulations, but often a sense of letdown, however unfairly that is among the court. Meanwhile, the mother herself was expected to undergo churching, a religious purification rite, and then get back to her duties swiftly, sometimes becoming pregnant again within months if her husband was impatient for more sons. The emotional strain of repeated bereavements was another element of misery. Many princesses had to bury children, sometimes one after another. Queen Blanche of Castile, a 13th century French queen, originally a Castilian princess, gave birth multiple times. Some children died young, though she was fortunate that her son, St. Louis, that is Louis IX, survived to adulthood. Margaret of Scotland, an English princess who married King Alexander III of Scotland, died in 1275 in childbirth, and so did the infant. A double tragedy, not uncommon in the records of the era. Joan of England, the daughter of Edward I, whom we met as Joan of Acre earlier, lost a teenage son on the battlefield, and 2 young sons in childhood. She didn't get far herself either, by the way. She died when she was 35, which is my current age. And when you think about it like that, you think, well, yeah, that's too young. In any case, it often fell to these women to endure such losses quietly and continue performing their roles. Society expected them to be paragons of fortitude. Public mourning was allowed for a time, but a princess should remain composed, dignified, and more importantly, ready to attempt more children, if she was still of childbearing age. The pressure to produce heirs also meant that a princess's personal health and preferences were secondary. If she had difficulty conceiving, various remedies might be tried. There might be prayers, potions, pilgrimages to shrines reputed to aid fertility. If she suffered painful or dangerous pregnancies, that was considered part of her burden to bear. That whole concept of my body, my choice, well, that did not exist, I'm afraid. Her body was effectively everybody else's choice, the property of her husband's lineage. One medieval moralist even wrote that a wife should be thankful to endure the pains of childbirth as her service to God and her Lord. Just a reflection of how thoroughly normalized this expectation was. And it should be noted that not all princesses resented motherhood. Many likely found genuine joy in their children, and some were very affectionate mothers by all accounts. The problem was that their children's survival and gender were matters of the state. A prince's success was too often judged in cold dynastic terms rather than in the warmth of family bonds. For instance, if a princess gave birth to 6 children and 5 survived, but none of them were male, the court might view it as a complete failure, despite all those new, happy faces brought into the world. On the other hand, if she bore a son, just one, but died, she might be praised posthumously as having done her duty by dying in the cause of securing the succession. Now, in the public eye, a medieval princess was not only expected to do her duty, but she was expected to embody virtue itself. Here's the main ones: chastity, fidelity, piety, generosity, meekness, and elegance. The list of ideal qualities was pretty long and exacting. Of course, the chastity, well, you've only got to embody that before you get married. Well, a king's daughter or a king's wife had to maintain a flawless reputation. If she faltered, gossip would spread like wildfire through Christendom's courts and chronicles, and if she fell into a real scandal, well, the consequences could be pretty dire for that, not only personally but politically. The stakes of her reputation were incredibly high. Her honor was a proxy for her family's honor, and by extension the stability of alliances and claims. From her childhood, a princess was instructed in the virtues of silence and good conduct. The 14th century Book of the Knight of the Tower, a guide written by a French nobleman for his daughters, is filled with cautionary tales of women who strayed from the path of virtue and met terrible fates. Many of those tales were meant for girls of the noble class in general, but they certainly applied to princesses. For example, the Knight of the Tower warned young women against the dangers of vanity, recounting stories of queens who dressed immodestly, or reveled too much and thereby lost their honor, eventually being punished by God. Princesses were cautioned to be humble and devout. They were to dress richly enough to reflect their status, but never in a manner that could be construed as lewd or prideful. They were expected to speak eloquently, but not too freely. A sharp tongue or a habit of gossip in a princess could become the talk of many realms. Christine de Pizan, in her advice to royal ladies, explicitly counseled princesses to avoid the slightest whiff of scandal. Keep reputable companions. Avoid private meetings with men who weren't your husband, and not indulge in empty amusements that might give people a reason to talk. A princess's behavior was in essence a constant performance of virtue. She prayed publicly, gave alms to the poor, and patronized religious foundations to burnish her image as a model of Christian queenship. Many princesses did so sincerely. Religiosity was a pretty genuine part of medieval life. But there was also an immense social pressure to at least appear saintly. But why did it all matter so much? Well, the answer to that is in part because a princess, especially one who was a queen, basically set the moral tone for the entire court. Chroniclers often compared the comportment of queens, one's praised for chastity and godliness, another disparaged for frivolity or even worse. And the common people, who usually never saw their monarchs except on procession, would circulate stories magnifying either the virtues or vices of high-born ladies. A virtuous princess could become a beloved figure of legend, St. Margaret of Scotland, who was revered for her piety and charity, for example. But if a princess transgressed, she could swiftly become the subject of, well, scurrilous songs and the mockery of the public. But the ultimate transgression, the mortal sin for a married princess, was adultery. Betraying the marital bond that had so much political significance. Accusations of adultery in royal circles caused sensational scandals. One infamous example that rocked Western Europe occurred in 1314 in the French royal family, known as the Tour Landry affair. Well, King Philip's the Fourth's 3 daughters-in-law, all of them young princesses of the House of Burgundy by birth, were accused of engaging in extramarital affairs with knights. Uh-oh, not allowed to do that. According to contemporary chroniclers, it was Philip's own daughter, Isabella, who noticed something amiss. She allegedly saw the Burgundian princesses give embroidered purses to 2 knights, and later observed those knights were wearing the tokens, arousing her suspicion of illicit relationships. Well, when this came to light, Philip IV launched an investigation, and the scandal exploded. 2 of the princesses, Margaret and Blanche of Burgundy, were found guilty of adultery, and their lovers were brutally executed. Reports say the unfortunate knights were skinned alive and mutilated before being put to death, a gruesome punishment reflecting the perceived enormity of their offense. As for the princesses, they didn't meet violent deaths, but their lives were effectively over. Their heads were shaved in shame, and they were locked away in a prison for life. Margaret, who had been the wife of the heir to the throne, died within a year. Rumors whispered that she was either starved to death or strangled. As for Blanche, well, she languished in captivity for years. Now the 3rd princess, Joan, who was accused mainly of knowing about the affairs, was spared harsh treatment due to her husband's support. She was eventually cleared and restored, but not without enduring house arrest and humiliation. The Tour Landry scandal didn't just destroy lives, it shook the French succession, and arguably contributed to the crisis that led to the 100 Years' War, since those princesses' sons were entangled in questions of legitimacy. This sensational episode shows a princess's infidelity was certainly not a private matter, couldn't get away with anything back in those days, but it was rather a treasonous and destabilizing event, and it had to be dealt with mercilessly. Well, heavy is the crown, as they say. Now, even short of adultery, a princess could suffer from mere rumors. Courts were hotbeds of gossip. A friendly exchange, or an overly gracious smile bestowed on a young courtier, could birth rumors that the princess had a lover. Some royal women had to fend off slander that they used witchcraft or potions, especially if something unfortunate befell their husbands or children. Joan of Navarre, an early 15th century queen of England, originally a Breton princess, was accused of sorcery against her stepson, King Henry V, charges widely believed now to be false and politically motivated, but at the time she was imprisoned nonetheless. Reputation was such a valuable commodity that a princess and their families would engage in active propaganda to protect it. They sponsored chronicles that portrayed them favorably. They commissioned artworks and poems that highlighted their purity or benevolence. If a princess made a misstep, damage control might involve lavish public acts of piety to swing back public opinion. For instance, after Queen Isabella of England, that is Isabella of France originally, led a rebellion against her husband, with a lover, Roger Mortimer, at her side, her son, King Edward III, eventually deposed her regency. Though Isabella had been arguably justified politically, her personal reputation, her personal reputation, suffered from having taken a lover and wielded power unfitting for a woman. So she spent the rest of her life in semi-seclusion, and chroniclers, especially later English writers, dubbed her the she-wolf of France, cementing an image of her as a femme fatale who broke almost every convention, successfully at first, but at cost to her legacy. Now let's look at the other side of the coin. Princesses who were meek and saintly were sometimes idealized to the point of legend after death. Elizabeth of Hungary, though a bit outside our Western Europe focus, was a 13th century princess renowned for her extreme charity and piety. After widowhood, she became a symbol of holy renunciation. Or if you want to look closer to Western Europe, Matilda of Scotland, an English queen, originally a Scottish princess, was celebrated for her goodness. Chroniclers wrote admiringly of how she would wash the feet of lepers and feed the poor daily. These portrayals, while undoubtedly exaggerating for hagiographic effect, served a purpose: to present the image of a perfect princess who upheld Christian virtue and helped legitimize her dynasty through her moral excellence. Thus, medieval princesses had to walk a narrow line. They had to be visible enough to radiate virtue and grace, but not so visible or autonomous as to invite criticism. They were expected to counsel their husbands quietly and wisely, but never appear to dominate them, at least not in public. Well, they should be beautiful, not flaunting, educated, but not presumptuous, generous, but not too extravagant. The chronicler William of Tyre once commented on a certain 12th century princess, Melisende of Jerusalem, praising her intelligence and capability, but then quickly tempering it by noting she still behaved with due feminine modesty. And that encapsulates the attitude. A princess could be competent, even powerful, so long as she embodied a culturally approved virtue and femininity. If she lost that aura, she lost everything. For once a princess' reputation was ruined, she virtually had no recourse. There was no justice for a woman accused of immorality. A word carried little weight against the tide of a scandal. But you might wonder, with all these constraints, did the princess have any avenue for empowerment or influence? The answer is yes, but also no, but also maybe. Can you repeat the question? Anyway, it's a bit complex. Generally, medieval Europe was a man's world politically. Women were excluded from direct rule in many places. Salic law in France, for instance, barred women from inheriting the throne. Yet princesses could and did wield power in certain circumstances. One of the most dramatic examples is Empress Matilda of England. Daughter of King Henry I of England and thus a princess by birth, she had been married off to the Holy Roman Emperor in her youth, gaining the title Empress. But widowed and without heirs, she returned to England, where her father named her as his heir, a pretty bold move at the time, when no woman had ruled England in her own right. Upon Henry I's death, Matilda's cousin Stephen seized the throne, leading to a long civil war, known as the Anarchy. Matilda fought to claim her rightful crown, commanding loyalty from a faction of nobles and even capturing Stephen at one point. In 1141, it seemed that she would finally be crowned queen. But the chroniclers describe how Matilda's own assertiveness became her undoing. Entering London to prepare for a coronation, she allegedly angered the citizens with her haughty demeanor. It didn't help that she was raising all of the taxes as well. The city rose against her, forcing Matilda to flee in haste. Legend has it she escaped in the snow from Oxford Castle, cloaked in white to avoid detection. Though undeniably competent and courageous, Matilda was branded by hostile chroniclers as proud and unfeminine for her ambition to rule. They called her Matilda the Empress, arrogant and unconciliatory. Ultimately, she never wore England's crown, though she negotiated with her son's succession years later. Matilda's struggle shows both the possibilities and perils. A princess trying to be a monarch, she could only push so far before societal norms and oppositions pushed back. She experienced battlefield hardships, sieges, and near captures, rare for a high-born lady. And while she survived and left a legacy, Matilda was personally denied the title of queen, and remembered with a mixture of respect and censure. Well, another instructive case is that of Isabella of France, whom we've already met as the neglected child bride of Edward II. Years later, Isabella took matters into her own hands spectacularly. Dispatched to France on diplomatic mission, she refused to return to England as long as her despised rival, the new royal favorite Hugh Despenser, held power over Edward. In France, Isabella formed an alliance with a faction of English exiles and with Roger Mortimer, a powerful lord and, more importantly, her new boyfriend. Well, in 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England, deposed Edward II, who was later murdered in captivity under pretty suspicious circumstance, and installed her young son as King Edward III, with Isabella and Mortimer acting as rulers in the king's name. For a short period, Isabella was the de facto sovereign of England, a position almost unprecedented for a woman not officially a queen regent. She demonstrated astute political maneuvering to achieve this. However, her transgression of traditional roles, armed invasion, wielding royal authority, and not to mention the open adultery, made her position untenable in the long run. By 1330, her son, chafing at Mortimer's control, asserted himself, had Mortimer executed, and forced Isabella into retirement. She lived the rest of her life quietly, kept in comfortable semi-captivity, so I suppose it's not all that bad. While chroniclers in her lifetime were sometimes respectful, after all, she was the king's mother, you can't talk too badly about her. Later tradition judged her pretty harshly. We already mentioned that epithet, she-wolf, the one who dared to overthrow a king. Well, still, not all exercises of power by princesses ended badly. Some navigated the currents more subtly and left positive marks. And Blanche of Castile was a fine example, a Spanish princess who became Queen of France as wife of Louis VIII, and later regent for her son Louis IX in the 1220s to 30s. Blanche faced down revolts by French nobles who bristled at being governed by a woman, yet she prevailed through a blend of diplomacy and sheer force of will. Chroniclers note that Blanche was deeply involved in government and in training her son to be a just king. She even led armies, or at least directed military strategy during her regency, successfully defending her young son's kingdom. Importantly, Blanche cultivated an image as a devout and devoted mother, which helped legitimize her rule. One famous story recounts that Blanche told the young King Louis IX, "I love you, my son, as much as a mother can love her child, but I would rather see you dead at my feet that you should ever commit a mortal sin." And this sort of saintly, maternal sternness endeared her to churchmen and chroniclers. Though she was undoubtedly a forceful ruler, history remembers her largely pretty kindly as the wise mentor of St. Louis and a stabilizing force in France. Now, this softer presentation of power made it a little bit more palatable, and indeed many princesses who held power did so indirectly or temporarily, acting as a regent ruling on behalf of a young child or absent husband, the socially accepted path. Through medieval Europe we find multiple instances. Matilda of Flanders, the wife of William the Conqueror, governed Normandy when William was off in England. Eleanor of Provence, the wife of King Henry III of England, who took a hand at statecraft and later led a faction to secure her son's reign. Margaret of Austria in the 15th century served as governor of the Low Countries and was renowned for her administrative skill. But still, the undercurrent was always that power was simply borrowed from a man. A princess who had to rule in her own right without a king to validate her often faced challenges to her legitimacy. Look at the Kingdom of Navarre in the 14th century. Princess Joan II of Navarre became queen regnant after her father died without sons. Navarre allowed female succession, by the way, although France did not. She ruled Navarre relatively peacefully for years, but she's a bit of obscure history compared to the majority of kings, a sign of how chronicles often underplayed even the successful female rulers. Or consider the varying fates of heiress princesses. Margaret, the Maid of Norway, a little princess who became heir to the Scottish throne in the 1280s, tragically died en route to claim her crown, plunging Scotland into a succession crisis. And some whispered that perhaps even if she'd lived, the rough Scottish lords might not have accepted a female monarch at all. Yet, for every princess who managed to influence or rule without scandal, there were those whose grasps to power led to hazard. And well, we've seen a few of them. Matilda, Isabella. We can add Margaret of Anjou as well as a cautionary tale. As Henry VI's queen, when her husband fell into madness, she stepped up to lead the Lancastrian faction in the War of the Roses. Margaret was a princess from France, thrust into a dynastic civil war in England. She fought fiercely for her son's inheritance, but the protracted conflict was vicious, and Margaret's enemies demonized her as a bloodthirsty foreign woman meddling in English affairs. In Shakespeare's later dramatization, drawing from chronicle traditions, Margaret is portrayed as a vengeful and passionate figure. Powerful, yes, but monstrous for a woman by the standards of the time. Historically, she ended up defeated, her son killed in battle, her husband murdered, and she herself captured, eventually ransomed back to France, living out her days in poverty. Unhappily ever after, I suppose. But in any case, one can't help but admire the perseverance of those who did seize the reins even briefly, in a world which told them they had no right to do so. And their lives tell us that amid the misery, there were also moments of agency. Costly, hard-won, sure, but quite real. And ironically, those very moments of agency often amplified the hardships they faced, as the backlash could be severe. The story of medieval princesses in power is thus bittersweet. They could be queens and kingmakers, regents and rebels, yet they had to walk through fire to do so. And most of the time, they did not make it out. And that's where we leave it today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I enjoyed doing this one. Telling stories that aren't often told, things that are a little bit overlooked. It's always a good idea. It's what this channel is all about. Now, I am going to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters, both on YouTube and Patreon. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfitnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Geoffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Venita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, David, Brittany, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, KTP, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolfsbane, Dude, Brinny, Aiden, Fabian, Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian Trail, Catherine, Alexa, Big Gun 101, Brandy, Bestie Hunt, Stevie, and Jessica. Thank you so much. I've appreciated having you here with me tonight. I hope you learned something or you just relaxed. In any case, the video worked, didn't it? But if you're still here, leave me a little comment and tell me your thoughts on all this. In any case, that is it from me tonight. Thank you again, lots of love to you all, and I will see you when you feel inclined to return. Farewell for now.